1 of our webinar. This is part 2. We are in the planning stages for part 3. We're going to summarize some of the modern email threats that folks have seen so we can attach it to the rest of the webinar. We're going to have a phase where we go through and assess your defenses. We've got some checklists. We've got some actionable items for people to follow. We have a most common areas section that people should pay attention to when assessing their risk and coming up with a plan. And then lastly, we've got some fine-grained steps in terms of how to prioritize what to do next after the webinar. Now, last time, we unpacked a lot during our webinar. I'm going to summarize. We had 5 points that we made in our last webinar. Number 1, that email threats persist despite a massive investment in anti-spam technology. We really unpacked that last time. Second thing is that phishing, the nature of it bypasses the effectiveness of a lot of existing anti-spam technology. We walked through that to make it clear as to why. The third thing, the responsibility for responding to email-based bad stuff, it's evolved from being a systems administrator's job into something that belongs to a chief security officer or at least to a C-suite executive. That was our third point in last time's webinar. Fourth thing, we brought to light a new scope that security-minded folks need to consider, that organizations exist in an online environment, and careful attention should be paid regarding how organizations can make themselves trustworthy. Also, that organizations are basically porous containers of individuals. The old focus of plugging holes and armoring individuals has given way to protections based on measuring and analyzing deviations from organizational norms. So we really tried to explain this new way of thinking. The final point from last time's webinar, the culmination of everything that we spoke about was the shared responsibility model that's on the screen now. Instead of focusing on what industries can do or what organizations should do and what individuals can do, Kevin and I shared the importance of looking at the relationship between organizations and their industries and between individuals and their organizations. So that was the culmination of last time's webinar. Now, for the next slide, Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Tim. So as we start thinking about what we're going to cover today, I want to ground the conversation with an understanding that phishing represents many things. And what we mean by that is that one of the points that we raised in our last session was that there's been this evolution from spam to a much more nuanced understanding, especially on that CISO or C-suite level that Tim just mentioned, of the kinds of threats that organizations face. That doesn't always translate to what the individual user might see, but today we're going to lay bare how those different phishing email threats are represented with examples of all of the common kinds that our organizations see. The important point here is that there are a set of common characteristics which manifest themselves in each of these different attack types. And there are very specific sets of things that you can do to protect yourself and protect your organization from them. But if we're going to play off the same sheet of music, we need to start by looking at what those characteristics are and ensuring that we have common language for the different kinds of threats that are classified under phishing by most email security professionals today. So what are those characteristics? The grayed out emails here are real phishing attacks that we've seen or received. We're calling out a couple of things here that are very notable, and you'll see in each of the subsequent examples that we're going to go through. The first is this concept of a trusted sender. And if you look on the top right, there's an email that is supposedly from this guy named Kevin O'Brien, who supposedly is trustworthy. The point here is that if I'm on a mobile device and if I'm an employee and I work for a company and my boss's name is Kevin O'Brien, that might be what I see. Might be the only thing that I see. Similarly, on the upper left, I have an email that's a little bit longer that claims to be from Office 365 security. And this is part of a social engineering attempt that an end user is seeing a message from someone or a service which they know, and it claims to be important and urgent. Whether that's, I'm in a meeting, I need you to immediately respond to me, or something is high priority. One of the characteristics of a phishing attack is that it's combining who you know with what you need to do. And in fact, that urgency is designed to shake someone enough that they might take an action that they would not normally consider, whether that's responding to an unusual email or it's clicking on a link and giving away credentials. And this continuum of different kinds of threats, from a trusted sender to an urgent request to a response that's required, it's designed to break down the psychological defenses that somebody might have. And there's a lot that we're going to cover here. Tim, I know trusted senders and some of this fits in well with what you're going to cover as well. Do you want to preview that just a little bit?
It does. 3 characteristics are in place. People inevitably respond, even if it's 1 out of 1,000 exposures, kinds of emails. Everybody slips up, and as we unpack some of this, we'll why. And I'm particularly interested in the trusted sender part, so you'll hear me chime in through the rest of the examples.
Perfect. So let's start with what is often the most common kind of phishing attack that we see: a name spoof, or sometimes a spear phishing attack, or sometimes a business email compromise attack. What these are manipulations of not a mail system directly, but rather the familiarity that somebody has with one of their colleagues. And a classic example here is the one that we showed just a moment ago, which we've replicated here on the bottom left. But these are all examples of an executive who has a group of people that work for them, and those people receive messages that come from emails that look like they are from the boss. And a name spoof is designed to find one of those relationships where somebody will often reply or feel like they have to reply based on that seniority difference. And you'll see that it is a manipulation of trust. And it's often happening in a way that will guarantee that message gets delivered, because it's coming from an email service like Gmail or Yahoo that may not have anything to do with the executives being impersonated, but the attacker is relying on the fact that those are well-formed emails and it's able to reach someone. And if they're sent at the right time of day, early in the morning, late at night, it's highly likely in today's society that someone's going to look at one of those things on their phone or tablet, where there's not going to necessarily be all of the context they would have if they were sitting in front of a full client on a desktop or laptop somewhere. So this concept is part of what we're going to cover in a few different angles. But I think it's important that we also have some understanding of this concept of what the from and the email address and the friendly from are. Tim, you're the expert here. Can you provide a little context and flavor?
Yep, you just hit some of the emails on the bottom there. The email header, the from header of an email that has 2 sections. People call it friendly from. There's sort of free-form text. Second part on the email address. This display of different phishing samples shows that some email clients will see both parts of a from header. Sometimes it gets suppressed in the name of simplicity and user experience. It makes it a little bit troublesome. But for these samples here, I think all boxes get checked. The trusted sender part shows up. There's a sense of urgency. Response required is respond, reply, click something. It's all there. The trusted sender part gets a little weird because Pat at remotemail.me might not necessarily be Kevin. Also, Earl Jordan 114 at gmail.com, probably not related to Kevin. Again, sometimes user interfaces themselves will obscure that part, which makes phishing detection harder.
Those same kinds of manipulations also can be exploited in organizations where the email configuration or the email service configuration isn't as strong. So the next level down here is a direct spoof. And what a direct spoof is is a very similar kind of attack. It's designed to impersonate a colleague's business email. But the way that it works is that an attacker identifies that their target's email domain has not fully implemented email authentication, meaning that things like Sender Policy Framework, SPF, Domain Key Identity Management, DKIM, or DMARC, some of which we're going to cover in a little bit when we talk about trusted senders, if those aren't configured correctly, or if they are configured correctly, but the sending attacker knows that the recipient is using an email service that doesn't respect them, it's possible to directly rewrite the mail headers and look like you are sending mail from someone inside of the organization. So Aaron Meacham here is the victim, or rather is the impersonated party to some victim of an attack like this. If Aaron was the CFO and one of his colleagues got this message, in this case, Emily Post, you can see in Outlook, which is what these screenshots are from, that it looks just like Aaron. His picture is there. The from address is actually Aaron at Flying Deliveries. All of this is so authoritative to the typical user that even if they've been trained to look at the from address, in this circumstance, they can't tell that this isn't really Aaron. There are ways that we can deal with that, and we're going to cover it in some detail. Tim, what are your thoughts here?
This sample here really, it calls out a weakness of email that's been around since I was born, which is anyone could send email pretending to be someone else. So it might not necessarily be Aaron at flyingdeliveries.com, but without taking additional action, flyingdeliveries.com can be spoofed by anyone. And real soon now in this webinar, we'll talk about how Aaron could take steps to convert his email domain to a trusted sender so that no one else could use his own email address and his own email domain to spoof email.
Of course, sometimes it isn't an individual who's being spoofed, it's a business service. This is one of the kinds of attacks that often gets conflated by an individual end user with spam. Spam is generally unwanted marketing email, or it's something that is designed to trick someone into thinking that they've won $1 million. It's volumetric. It's very broad-based. Business service spoofing utilizes some of the techniques there, but it's often more targeted. And when it's crafted and sent to a business or an organization, it's based and predicated upon an understanding of whom at that business might do some set of relation or work with an external party. A CFO or a controller might log into the corporate bank account. Somebody who typically gets quarantine reports for their email on an executive team or sales team is susceptible to an impersonation of their mail security provider's quarantine email. Or, of course, someone who's in a marketing role or a remote work role might fall victim to something that says that there's a change in service for their remote telework solution. These examples are not impersonating someone inside the business, either through business email compromise techniques like that registration of a Gmail address or through direct spoof, but instead they're impersonating an external party that the business is familiar with. These are tough because a business service spoof is going to look like a message that isn't within the control of the recipient's organization. Often, they're properly branded, they're using the right logos, the right colors. Sometimes they're in fact identical to the real emails. And they'll usually, unlike a business email compromise attack, which asks someone to respond, they'll have a call to action that's about clicking on something or doing something. And the really savvy attackers are weaving together the link for the actual service. Take log me in. That logo might really go to log me in, but then the body of the message, which says that you've earned 3 months of service for free, has a redemption link. And that's where the actual attack is that will go and steal those credentials. So this is a tough one. There are still some things we can do. Tim?
Yeah, hey, I just got to report that my audio is pretty crap. So if it's still bad, I might call in, but I'll go to this section. You guys can tell me. The trusted sender of the case is incredibly difficult for anyone to figure out if it's real because the email client doesn't actually let you know what the email address is. But this is a good illustration of how even experts would have an impossible time trying to separate the real from the fake, because the tools, the applications, they don't allow people to peek under the hood.
And that's, I think, one of the things that often leads to the most dangerous kind of attack. And that is the direct distribution of malware or of ransomware or of some other piece of code that, if somebody were to execute it on their endpoint device, will compromise the device itself. So when we think about all of these attacks, business email compromise attacks are the technically least difficult to implement, because you're simply registering a Gmail address or a private email address and then using that to send a message that looks like it comes from a colleague. Often the call to action or the request for a response is very light. Please respond to me, please reply to me. We see these within the context of what we do at GreatHorn as door knock attacks. And what we mean by that is that an attacker is probing. They're trying to figure out if someone will open the door. That may not actually result in a cybersecurity breach, but if you have 10,000 people working for your organization, and I can identify the 10% of them whom we can potentially exploit, I know who to maybe send the business service spoof to that will allow someone to go and get access to a set of credentials to execute this sort of attack. And this sort of attack is the last one in the chain where you have malware distribution or something that can cause real financial damage. What we see here is an example of, in this case, a combinatorial attack. And what we mean by that is this is an impersonation of a human resources department, and it's most likely being sent to a specific set of users who have demonstrated that they will respond to other kinds of phishing attempts, these door knocks or probes. And in this circumstance, look at the characteristics we see. We see the same impersonation of, in this case, a department. We see urgency. You have to reply by a specific date. And you have a PDF or a Word document or some piece of endpoint compromising malware that user is supposed to open. This is where we see the most dangerous kinds of attacks. And it's very difficult, especially for a user who has already demonstrated that they are vulnerable to these kinds of phishing attempts, to identify and then respond to these issues without having access to something that arms them with a little bit more data. Thankfully, there are some things that we can do. Tim, I know you were resolving some audio issues. Do we have you back?
I sure hope this is coming through.
Yep, we've got you back, Tim.
So, last example there, press the sender perspective. It actually is human resources, but extra R, so it's these workers.com.us. That's the thing that users are also going to do is lookalike domains.
Tim, I think we're still struggling a little on the audio side, so let me pick this up and give you a minute.
Okay.
And we'll see if we can sort that out. So I'm going to just pick up what Tim was talking about, highlighting the value of practicing on these kinds of things. What we're seeing here is that there are phishing tactics and countermeasures, right? So we have covered some of the tactics that attackers will use. Display name spoofs, these email and address spoofs, and so on and so forth. Diligent expert users might be able to consistently identify and detect these attacks, but even the experts can get it wrong. And for the rest of us who aren't email security experts, it is very difficult to universally see when a message is fake or when it's real. And given enough time and enough examples of these attacks, eventually it's going to make a mistake and do something wrong. And that's partially because it's not clear what the right thing is. That's the state of the world today, especially with respect to email security. The common areas that you can think about as we now shift gears from talking about what the overall set of attacks look like and defining some of our terms to beginning to look at the point of this webinar, which is what are the countermeasures that I can put in place to protect myself, or that I can start to look at things like my mail authentication. Mail authentication has two components to it. Have I implemented it correctly? And I know, Tim, when we go through this, we'll talk about trusted senders and what DMARC does and how this plays out to protect your brand from being impersonated. But also, what's my email security provider doing? Is it respecting authentication? Recall that a moment ago, we talked about what it looks like when I have a message that comes from log me in. Let's say that message does fail DMARC. Well, if my mail provider doesn't work with DMARC correctly, it's highly unlikely that I have selected an email provider that's going to allow me as an end user to see the details and know if there's an attack here. So there's a selection component here that you need to do, and you need to at least know where you stand. Similarly, we have to make it easier for users to verify sending addresses and verify whether an address is the correct one. We can do this both manually, but also with technology. I will address this in a moment as we go through more of this action framework. Header data, often opaque for an end user, but technologically available, and you can build both business process and make investments into technology to help identify whether or not a message is legitimate or looks like it's one of these spoof attempts that we've covered. And finally, think about those actual high-risk actions where you're being asked to click on a link, often because you got to release something or fix something or listen to a voicemail, or you're opening a file. There are things that can be done to help organizations arm their users to identify risk at the link level or the file level, and then from there, take that into a business process that can be expanded upon by technology and minimize, you can never eliminate, but minimize those risks through those investments. So I think that's where we're going to spend the majority of the rest of our time together today. And we're going to cover off some of the different things that can be done. I believe Tim's back, and I think the audio is in good shape now. So Tim, why don't I hand it over to you to talk about that assessment, and then we'll go from there into some of the action items and checklists.
Sure. For the last one there, Kevin, that you were talking about, apologies for the audio ins and outs. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Let me just do a quick sound check.
You sound great, Tim.
Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah, for the last one about the phishing tactics and the countermeasures, hopefully, Kevin, you're able to touch on that. Even diligent experts, they might be able to figure out if what they're seeing is a phish or not, but even experts mess up. And then given the rest of us, for the rest of us, even with enough time and attempts, everyone does something wrong because it's not clear what the right thing is against all these phishing attacks. And that's essentially the state of today's world. But the danger zones that we have up on screen now, this is the new stuff. As simple as this graphic is, it represents the gaps that need to be addressed if the internet is to become a safer place, and if it's to become a safer place for the organizations and the individuals that hang out on it. So the intersections, they represent the weakest points in the phishing defenses. And so what we're going to go into now is how well do our organizations conform to the standards that we have to help publish and secure an identity. And also we're going to go through if an organization's policies are in place to actually protect users. So to translate that for our next view here, the actionable areas of protection. Touching upon what happened during the last webinar, today's state of the art, it's all about defending and keeping bad actors out, and maybe even protecting paying customers if it's possible. But the change here that we went through, and we're showing again right now, is to make your organization something that can be trusted online. As a sidebar, more and more organizations, they're recognizing the the value in protecting the shared commons. It's kind of I don't want to say a dated concept, but it's still very real. There's a group of companies primarily based in North America called the CyberTech Accord. They've come together and said, hey, we're all going to try to do the right thing online, not just to protect organizations and businesses, but to protect end users that might not otherwise have a piece of a company. But prior to this group of companies getting together and publishing their manifesto, there were a handful of internet-based companies that maintained dedicated staff to improve the online environment. PayPal was notably one of them. It takes deep understanding and a position of authority, though, within these large companies to maintain these departments. And what we've seen is over time, the bean counters win, and the dedicated staff has to move on. So the kind of efforts that are in place to protect the online environment, just generically, they come and they go, but there's more and more recognition that more companies need to lock arms and focus on. So the CyberTech Accord, it's a neat kind of resurrection of the idea that the internet needs more care and maintenance, and that everybody who operates on it can do something to keep it going in a good direction. For the protection parts, Kevin's going to talk about those, but first I'm going to walk through the prevention bits. Kevin, do you want to give a brief preview of the protection section?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we'll start on the prevention side. As we drill into protection, we're going to look at what that transition point looks like between what's happening around that concept of the shared commons and what Tim is describing with respect to your organization's trusted sender approach and how you manage online identity. And we're going to segue into looking at what you can do at the individual mailbox or even individual user level and how you can protect yourself and start to build robust protection into your mail workflow without interrupting how users interact with mail on a daily basis. We'll get to that in just a minute. Why don't we start on the prevention piece and managing online identity?
All right. Now, as part of a larger posture, one should consider your organization's online identity excuse me, across things like the public internet in terms of the World Wide Web and email, also across private networks, things like social media and application marketplaces. We're not going to go into all those different kinds of properties, if you will. We're going to focus on email. But the key point here is that it's not enough to assume that everyone else can reliably figure out if you're real online. We need to make it easy for others to trust and verify. Our focus for the webinar is on email, but if I were a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, or if I was aspiring to blend in some of their skills, I'd have to consider that my job would be to make sure that my organization is doing all it can to be trustworthy across all networks, public internet and also private networks. That brings us to the next slide. Almost everyone has heard the statistic that every fraudulent thing, or pretty close to it, that happens on the internet starts with an email. It's true. The strong focus the security industry has had on filtering out unwanted email, it brushes up with the idea that we all have to deal with going through security checks with the assumption that we're criminals. That is, good actors have to get through the same filters as bad actors. That's why bad actors are successful at getting phishing email in front of unsuspecting victims. They just have to do a really good job of pretending to be a good actor. The prevention part of this discussion is about turning your organization into a trusted sender, a sender that cannot be spoofed or faked, but more importantly, it provides something that others can build upon to make communication easier and safer. Slide, please. The benefits, so we're on the trusted sender benefits. At a high level, the reasons why organizations turn themselves into trusted senders is to separate themselves from bad actors by making themselves easy to identify. To take advantage of built-in capabilities that let an org tell the world, hey, if you get something that pretends to be us but isn't, just save yourself the hassle and drop it. And it's also to help build a trusted email ecosystem by providing something that others can build upon. These benefits, they could be blended or remixed into concrete terms with words like you can get strong exact domain anti-phishing protections, you can get simplified email delivery, and you can also get yourself an improved internet-facing security posture. But we'll ease off on the jargon. Next view, please. A piece of technology was invented a few years ago to allow for trusted senders to exist in the world of email, which is pretty great. If you'll recall the phishing examples that we stepped through, the first component was trusted sender. Did you get a piece of email from someone that you know? So what we're talking about now is to make it so that you are the trusted sender and you can disallow everyone else from pretending to be you. And that's a pretty strong first step to take to blocking a lot of bad email. The technology that was invented is called DMARC, and it allows organizations to control how internet domains are used within an email, specifically where an email purports to come from. DMARC, the technology, it gives domain owners the ability to tell the world how to deal with email that fails DMARC compliance. It gives feedback to domain owners to make DMARC deployment easy. It simplifies how everyone checks email. It doesn't do much on paper, but DMARC exists at an interesting intersection of email and internet domains. It's also how one becomes a trusted sender. So the point of this webinar is to share how phishing is evolving and how organizations can effectively respond to the bad actors. Next slide, please. Sometimes we need to wane philosophical and actually do stuff. So to understand if your organization exists as a trusted sender of email on the internet, there are two things to do. One, pull together a big list of all domains owned and operated by your organization. Just as email domains are used across an entire organization, orgs can also use more than one email domain. The rest of the world can determine if a domain belongs to your organization. So take time to figure out if your organization is centrally managing these internet assets. That's the first thing to do. The second thing to do is, for each of your domains, figure out if you're using DMARC. On the screen, you'll see three different sites. dmarcian's DMARC inspector is listed first. If imitation is flattery, dmarcian is one flat company. Thank you. The second is a link to internet.nl, which offers a pretty wide assessment of an email domain, along with websites and a few other facets of an internet domain. The last link is to the Global Cyber Alliance. The GCA, as they're known as, has put an incredible amount of work into helping orgs of all sizes understand and get started with DMARC. And each of these three organizations, they exist to make the internet a safer place. You can't go wrong if you look at any of them or all of them. Now, next slide. To wind up this section, it's only fair to share what to expect when getting started down the road to becoming a trusted sender. These actions, they sketch out at a high level what the work looks like. 1 through 5. The first one is to, excuse me, once you start getting data flowing, this is what it looks like. You'll get a bunch of DMARC data. Based upon that data, you can identify the different vendors and pieces of infrastructure that are sending email on behalf of one of your email domains. Next thing you want to do is to start building an internal process to make the maintenance of DMARC and its related technologies something that's built into your own operations team. It could just be a series of checklists, but it's important to know that it does take a little bit of care and feeding. Not a lot, but it's better to have a little bit of care and feeding than none. Third thing, there's a process that you can go through to fix up all of the things that are sending on your behalf and to make them compliant with DMARC. Once that part's done, you can then roll out DMARC controls that prevents people from using your domains. And then lastly, in recognition of the internal process built out in step 2, you can go into maintenance mode. And this DMARC and your internet domains become just another asset that you just need to keep locked down. It shouldn't be an ongoing cost that's expensive. There's just a one-time work that needs to get done. Lastly, next view, please. Becoming a trusted sender, it allows oneself and the rest of the internet to build trust. That's what it's all about. Building trust, it takes time, and it's not a substitution for real protection from all the other badness that DMARC doesn't address. Things like indirect spoofs, lookalikes, or cousin domains, just completely irrelevant fake domains that are attacking your users, compromise legitimate infrastructure. There's a lot of stuff that DMARC and becoming a trusted sender does not address. So protecting against bad actors requires more. And Kevin's going to walk us through what it looks like to protect for real against phishing.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So let's talk about that. If your external risk and some of the things that can happen as people impersonate your user base are about prevention, internal risk and how your organization's unique landscape of mail infrastructure and mail security manifests those threats are where protection comes in. The easiest way to understand that is to look at this concept of an email security lifecycle. Email security lifecycle management is different today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Legacy technologies have focused on establishing hard exteriors and crunchy interiors, right? The idea of perimeter security is that I'm going to put a wall up and only let good email in. But in today's modern, especially cloud-enabled email landscape, you need a much more robust and much more dynamic approach to identifying and putting security controls in, not just at the moment that a message is received by your users, but also continually reassessing what the risk that message poses might be, or what those risks are, and then having both automated threat response, so some mechanism by which you can take dangerous messages or dangerous content and remove them or defang them, but also a recognition that information security is an imprecise art and not a perfect science. Having instant response tools that allow your organization and your IR teams to jump on a message that's dangerous and get it out of even hundreds of thousands of mailboxes in near real time. That life cycle is where you start to see three things come into play: process, people, and technology. Process is obviously going to be where you're going to start because it's the least investment required to begin to write rules, or you may already be subject to them depending on whether your organization or your industry is regulated around how things like financial transactions occur, how urgency is communicated when it comes to anything related to intellectual property or the business, how change management is supposed to occur. We'll look at those in detail in a moment. The next thing that will happen is we'll take a look at how people engage with process. And so there is a misconception here. And the misconception is that your people are your weakest link. You'll hear training companies that are trying to get you to buy training products tell you that you have people who are a huge risk to your business unless you train them. There's some compliance truth to that, perhaps, but in practice, you need to turn those people into security assets. And we'll look at how you can do that in just a moment. And then finally, we're going to have a look at technology, and we're going to evaluate what it looks like when we start to take all of the tools that you can put in place and use them to enforce and enhance your own security posture and build upon those process and investments in staff that you make in the first two areas. So let's get down to brass tacks. What do you do with respect to process? Process fundamentally is about protecting against financial risk and information risk. If you think about the legacy market, things like data loss prevention or DLP are the technological layers that people have put in place that will detect that there might be a wire-related email coming in, or that someone is sharing sensitive data or regulated data. That's good, but detecting the presence of potentially regulated or risky information isn't useful unless you have written process that everyone understands that says, this is how we're supposed to respond to that. And oftentimes the social engineering that goes into the spear phishing attack examples we showed at the beginning, that urgency and that appeal to authority that it's coming from the boss, are based upon the understanding an attacker has of where the weak points are in your process. If it doesn't matter who asks for a wire transfer, your business has a rule that says we never do that unless we have had double verification with a phone call in addition to a written request, and it's gone through a very specific workflow before it reaches the finance team. You're not going to be as susceptible to, hey, I'm in a meeting, please wire $10 million to this address. That is a process starting point. And obviously what we're talking about here runs from finance to HR to how executives communicate with staff members. But there are a number of things that you can do. If you're looking at this and wondering how you can begin to build robust practices and put some rules around this, you can go to any number of resources on the web. The SANS Institute, SANS, has some process. NIST publishes various rules about this. And of course, you can obviously work with an audit firm if you're undergoing something like a SOC 2 or some other trust attestation process to get an understanding of what is applicable for your industry. Secondly, let's talk about users. So I mentioned this concept that users are often seen as being a source of risk. It's not true, and it's something that you can start to address by changing that mentality. But often that mentality comes from information security, and it's where you can begin to look at and think about those users differently. Users interact with mail on a daily basis. 100% of white-collar professionals open 100% of their mail. They may not do something with every one of those emails, but I can guarantee you they're seeing them. And what that means is that if we can take those users and treat them as our front line and ensure that we have put the controls in place that let them make better decisions, instead of worrying that they're going to click on that log me in free offer, we're going to have a set of processes that say that there's certain ways that provisioning of technology happens and maybe that user shouldn't click it, but we're going to reinforce it through investment in tools and some of the things that we talked about in Tim's section about how you can also enforce at your email provider level things like mail authentication to minimize that risk. And critically, you have to have a way for those end users to provide feedback, both positive and negative. If they're not sure whether a message is safe, you need to arm them visually and at that moment with security information that integrates that feedback into your broader security posture. There are ways you can do this with technology, and this is often something that organizations will start with, and it will reinforce the good hygiene and good security processes that we've been talking about. And that's really where I think you'll see the rubber meet the road, which is the concept that there are technological investments you can make, which can extend your mail process and your mail security posture down to the individual mailbox level or even email message level. And there are many different solution providers out there. We're in an exciting time for what has historically been a very not exciting industry. And we'll talk in a minute about what the next steps look like with this webinar series. But the things that you can think about generically before we talk specifics about what GreatHorn or dmarcian can do is you can look at where your gaps are. So assessing your existing threat detection tools against phishing threats is the first item here. I would actually insert one above that, which is understanding what your phishing landscape is. If you don't have a robust understanding of exactly where the threats are, who's receiving them, how susceptible they are, whether those are resulting in some form of account compromise or account takeover, you can't make good technology decisions. There are plenty of vendors out there that will use marketing to try to get you to go buy something, but you may be solving a problem you don't have or missing a critical one that you do. In addition, there are non-vendor-based technology decisions you need to make, like ensuring that multi-factor authentication is turned on across all of your mail apps. Much harder for someone to compromise your username and password if they have to also have a third-party authenticator application on your phone. And that is a kind of decision that is often free, aside from the effort that goes into building this out and implementing it within your company. Having implementation and feedback mechanisms and then a response framework for that is the third leg of the table here. And you need to ensure that when a user is seeing something that's suspicious, you've taught them that they should report it, but you also made it easy. Just asking them to forward it to InfoSec and then having nobody respond to them is unlikely to change behavior in the long term. And behavior and behavioral adaptation is one of the foundations of good email security enablement and enforcement. So look for ways that you can use technology to make that a one-click process. Great, thought this was suspicious, got some visual information in real time about whether it was a threat or not, and had a mechanism by which I could do something that has some feedback built into it. And then finally, your business or your organization is going to be unique. We work with at GreatHorn many, many different companies, from Fortune 500s to small technology shops. They all have different security requirements when it comes to email. Your organization's not going to look like any of the ones that are around you. So you need to be thinking about what those customizations are. And that's also a function of your own risk tolerance. If you don't do financial transactions via wire, having technology in place that detects requests for wire transfers and enforces a policy of wiring money out is probably not applicable. But if you have a tremendous number of access credentials and keys that people are trying to steal, that's probably your focus point and where you need to go in order to protect yourself from a spear phishing attack targeted at your business. Let's talk next steps and where we go from here. Tim, why don't you summarize kind of what we've just said, and we'll go from that into where an organization can take away the key points from this webinar.
That's good. From a high level, we tried to identify why phish is still an issue. We then figured out where key areas existed that have been underserved. The first part was in looking at how your organization exists online, specifically in terms of being a trusted sender. The second big part was in looking at email security as a life cycle as opposed to a snapshot in time. We've built out process, people, and technology to implement the life cycle. Combining the two approaches that we've gone through in this webinar to address the underserved areas places your organization ahead of the phishers. Incidents may happen, but you'll be able to get back up, respond, learn, and be increasingly resilient going forward. The next steps on the screen here, they should place you on the right path. Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's right. And when we think about what that path is, the most important thing that you can take away from this webinar is that you need to have a plan for what you're going to do with the intelligence that you can generate. Having a good understanding of where your risk profile is and what you want to do in order to mitigate some of that risk is much more important than how much you're going to spend on your next tool that you're going to bring in. Consistent planning and an understanding of what the process is and an understanding as to whether or not you are capable of looking at that entire email lifecycle and integrating both prevention and protection, that's the key to making what we've covered today actionable. As it would happen, both Tim and I work for organizations that have a vested interest in this. Tim, do you want to say just a couple of words about what you do, and I'll wrap up on mine?
Yes, do have a vested interest in making the internet better. I've had the pleasure of helping to build DMARC, see it shipped publicly, and then made dmarcian to help people deploy the technology. It's great to have a commercial company that can provide with services because we don't have to beg universities or governments to give us grants. Instead, we focus on customers deploying DMARC. So Kevin, us getting together and working through this webinar, it's been a pleasure because the webinar itself isn't just about DMARC or just about what GreatHorn's offering. It's a conceptual model that people should be able to take away from and work on their own security posture in a sane way. So I'm pretty excited about the whole thing. Kevin?
And I'm excited because we look at this from a different angle. Didn't help invent DMARC, but I've been doing security and in this space for the last 20 years, and I've seen the evolution and shift from infrastructure that organizations directly control to a cloud world where we're working all the time on heterogeneous devices. I've seen the evolution of that in terms of what it means for risk and threat as well. And one of the challenges to security is that security is an incredibly complex topic, and it's easy to make poor decisions when you don't have a good understanding of what the whole landscape is and where those threats are. So by aligning with DMARC, by aligning with the process control that it provides, GreatHorn can cover the other half of that life cycle. And that's what we do. We are a pure SaaS application that can deploy in 5 minutes or less and help organizations using cloud-native email systems like Office 365 or G Suite take those protective actions that we covered in the latter half of the presentation and do so in lockstep with the work that they're doing on DMARC and prevention. I think that brings us home today. This is obviously the second in a 3-part series, and we will be having a third part where we'll get real hands-on and look at what dmarcian and GreatHorn do and how they operate. But why don't I turn it over to Larita to cover logistics, and to whatever degree we have time, take some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Kevin, and to Tim as well. Just as a quick reminder, you can put in questions in the GoToWebinar control panel, probably on the right side of your screen. We do have a few that have come in. The first is, you talk about arming our users with context, but how that can help if they don't understand it?
It's a great question. There's a little bit of probably both Tim and I here, but why don't I take a first pass? You know, there's a lot of complex information inside of email headers, and even just in the conversation today, you heard Tim describe some of the differences between mail froms and friendly froms and display names. The trick here is to figure out what matters and building a heuristic approach to email risk. And what we mean by that is that you can tell someone this message is unusual or dangerous, or it's not. And you can make that not a categorical decision. That's what legacy tools did. They said, that's a bad email, quarantine it. That's a good email, deliver it. Dust your hands off, call it a day. We're in a much more nuanced world today. You can provide people with information and facts about the messages they're looking at without taking away their autonomy or ability to make a decision. And by doing that, you're arming people with additional insight, and they typically slow down, pay attention to what you're telling them. And then if you have that closed loop, remember, one of the core components of a good protection plan is that you have some mechanism by which you can take feedback from those users. If you make that super easy, right in the message or right in the mail client, now you're starting to actually feed that pause and thought process back into your overall security program.
Yeah, I have to agree, but I have to call out that there's an element of going back to the basics for users and for security folks at different organizations. We can't assume that employees or members of an organization know anything at all about email. So by going back to basics, it's important to have a form of awareness training. You know, you could probably package it internally to call it something a little bit more exciting, but you can't assume that people, just because you assign them a laptop and you're online, that they actually know that the internet's full of criminals that are trying to defraud everybody all the time. So I think from a very basic first step, it's important to let people know there are bad actors out there. No, you haven't done anything wrong, and you're not, you know, it's not a retribution crime or anything like that. There's just mean people out there looking to defraud everybody, and it's cheap and easy on the internet. So in terms, from a program perspective, at the very top, have a process so when people join a company, they know that there's just a little bit of training in place to say, this is email, this is how it works. There's bad people out there. If something's suspicious, you know, ask someone in the company for help on it. And there's no wrong answers. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. Then the context-based tools, I think, can make sense a lot more to just normal people trying to get their work done. I think that's often neglected, is that we assume people know an awful lot of information, when most people probably don't care to know the ins and outs of email or security systems.
Great, thanks to you both for that answer. The next question could be a short or a long answer, but how do we judge the best place to start?
You know, I think we've put some thoughts here in the slides around what those checklists look like, but the place to start is by understanding where you are today and where your risks are. You can use tools, look at what Tim put up with respect to the dmarcian analysis tool to understand your organization's DMARC posture, or what GreatHorn can do for you with respect to understanding what kind of phishing messages you're getting. You can also assess your policies. You can send sample attacks to users, I guess, although driving down user confidence in your email is probably not the way to fix your email security problems. But you have to know where you're coming from. That's where I would start from. And I think that assessment step is the critical one. What do you think, Tim?
I think it's a great question. I'll try to keep it short, but it really matters on where you're at within your organization. If you're a CISO, then there's some pretty good programs that one can go through to do the assessment and to move a company or an organization through its security paces. Let's say you're not a CISO and you're just a smart person at an organization, and you think, wow, there's, you know, no one's ever paid attention to this stuff before. At some point, you might want to consider looking at the soft underbelly of the business, just to figure out if there are some protections in place. For our next step slides, we had evaluate your risk against the biggest threats. if you're cutting checks at a company and you're in accounts payable, that's probably a good place just to start. Do we have a process? Does the CEO ever, fly and lose all their money in their passport and then call random people to try to get them to send the money? Things like that. I think it has to start with awareness. If you're at an organization and you already don't have a mandate to make change, you just have to start kind of pulling on strings to figure out, are there actual protections in place? And Kevin mentioned before that there's quite a few robust frameworks that one can take on and implement, but I can't make assumptions based upon the question. That's it.
Great, thank you. So I know that we're actually coming right out to the half hour, and so while there are a couple of other questions that have come in, we're going to go ahead and respond to those individually after the event is over. I want to take this time to thank everybody in the audience for joining us for this webinar, and of course to our speakers, for Tim and Kevin, for providing us with this information. As I mentioned earlier, we have recorded this webinar and we'll be providing both the slides and the webinar recording to all the registrants after the webinar.